that you're also a part of, and that gave you a lot, but you also gave something in return to this cultural center. The thing is, you made a film, The Horses of God, that takes place in the same neighborhood as the film that we saw today, the film where the cultural center also takes place. This film has a much grimmer story maybe to tell, maybe also not. Everything is a bit connected, but it's about boys that are being, let's say, radicalized and eventually coerced into becoming terrorists. It's a very heavy film, and this one seems to be much more hopeful. So first of all, what I maybe wanted to ask is your cinema becoming a bit more hopeful maybe? Is there more joy to be found in reaching young people? Can you tell maybe a little bit about this development from these very grave political stories? And even though this film is still quite grave, but in a sense it's much more about the joy of creativity and sharing.
You know what? Those youngsters, they gave me true lots of hope. When I see where they live, in which conditions of life, the problems they have to face with every day, maybe more girls than boys, but still. And I see their relationship to life, to their art, to their need, the essential need. It's a question sometimes of death or life for them to go and to say who they are through rap, through hip hop, through theater, through whatever. Yes, they give me lots of hope. And it's true that when I did Horses of God in this neighborhood of Casablanca, Sidi Moumen, it was quite despair period of my life because I couldn't understand how a 10-year-old boy could turn himself into a suicide bomber. Because actually they all came from that neighborhood. It's not in Morocco,
Yes,
it's in Casablanca. They all came from that neighborhood. They were 13 or something like that. And they reached the center of Casablanca and they killed themselves. And from those graves, I could see in that center some beauty coming up through their stories, you know. And that beauty, I wanted to tell it because I think it's important that the world sees it and hears it. And at the very beginning of the project, I didn't know if I would do a fiction film or a documentary. I was ready for a documentary, by the way. I was ready for a pause in my cinema to go for something more personal, you know, that would tell the story of those youngsters and somehow the story of my childhood and how they can turn each other. But slowly, and it took time, like 3 years, I decided to write a story and shoot it and rewrite it and re-edit it, and that's how the film came up.
Maybe one more question before I turn towards the audience, but you told about you wanted to make a story that honors them, but also in a sense your childhood. And can you maybe bring us into the emotional process of working on this film and seeing these fantastic young people and their creativity and their energy, and then relating it to what you was as a young man? What was that process like for you, and how much of yourself did you recognize still in this new generation of young people, and also maybe how much did you have to catch up with what youngsters nowadays are going through and talking about and experiencing?
You know, I grew up in between 74 and 84, 85 in the banlieue, what's called the banlieue of Paris, in a city called Sarcelles. I don't know if some of you knows it, which is quite a harsh place. And in the middle of the towers, there were like this little island, the Forum des Cholettes. That's the cultural center. At that time, there were communist mayors in the banlieue, and they had this wonderful idea originated from André Malraux, the foreign, the past Minister of Culture in the 60s in France, that everywhere where people could not go to culture anymore, culture should go to them. And so that's where, at the beginnings of the 80s, I saw the rap movement merging, coming from the United States, you know, Africa Bambata, Grandmaster Flash, and so on. And I saw how our friends, our older friends, our big brothers could take advantage of this movement to say who we are, you know, and that's the very first time that we didn't feel invisible anymore. And so when afterwards I felt less and less interested in hip hop because it became more bling bling, you know, more ego trip. But then in the Arab world, I saw those youngsters, this youth, using this tool as a political tool. During the Arab Springs, we could have seen that, but since then in Algeria, since 2 or 3 years, also in the Iraq movement, it's words of rappers that are, you know, coming up in the riots.